to look at them. The next thing on your chair is one of the things that National Council, the Advocacy Committee of National Council is trying to do now. Not only do we want to have these educationals to educate the community on issues that we think are really important, but we also want people to leave feeling they have done something aside from being educated. And so what we've done today is you will find on your chair something that says, "Take action today." And what it is it's a letter urging the President, First Lady, other prominent elected officials to continue to protect the free exercise of women's health care and rights, and to preserve our freedom of choice as guaranteed by the United States Constitution. So when you can sign it now, you can sign it later, but we would appreciate it if you agree with what this letter says, if you would sign it, and there will be people at the door on the way out, and if you hand it to them, we will make sure that these are mailed, and this is going to be our first action meeting where we have action. Okay, is everyone here? Everyone's here. Good. Okay, so we're going to start. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Josel, and I'm Vice President of Advocacy for the National Council of Jewish Women in Los Angeles. And I'd like to welcome you to our commemoration of the 40th anniversary of Roe v. Wade. Before we start talking about Roe v. Wade, though, I'd like to tell you a little bit about who we are, because we have some new people here. Some of you have heard me say this before, but I just hope you'll be patient. The National Council of Jewish Women is a grassroots organization of volunteers and advocates who turn progressive ideas into action. We are over 100 years old, and I want you to know that when I joined this organization, I did not have gray hair. So this is to show you what this organization has done and how old we are. We are inspired by Jewish values. We strive for social justice by improving the quality of life for women, children, families, and by safeguarding individual rights and freedoms. If you like what you see, if you like what you hear today, please join us. We are an equal opportunity organization. You don't have to be a woman, you don't have to be Jewish. You basically just have to believe that you want to be involved in the forefront of social change by helping put our beliefs into action. And as you walk out, there is a table, a membership table, and you can get all the information that you need. Today's event is sponsored by National Council of Jewish Women in Los Angeles, California Planned Parenthood, Miracle Mile and Hollywood Now, the City of West Hollywood, and the West Hollywood Women's Advisory Board. And even though the Director of Advocacy, Ruth Williams, went home sick, none of this could have happened without her. So we always want to thank her, even in absentia, because she works very, very hard. So why are we here today? It's such a beautiful day. We can go to the beach, we can go to the mountains, we can sit out in the sun. Also, we live, whether you're aware of it or not, in the #1 pro-choice state in the nation. So it's really amazing. So really, what else is there for us to do? Well, I'm here because 40 years after Roe v. Wade, many women are still unjustly denied access to abortions due to a federal restriction which is called the Hyde Amendment. This amendment withholds insurance coverage of abortion in most federal health programs, such as Medicaid, except in cases of rape, incest, and when a woman's life is at risk. I am here because in Mississippi, they just closed the last clinic for abortion. I am here because in Fargo, North Dakota, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and Little Rock, Arkansas, there's only one clinic left for women who need abortions or reproductive health advice. And I'm here because I remember my mother telling me that she had 3 illegal abortions because she couldn't afford to have children because she was the sole breadwinner of our family. And as a National Council of Jewish Women advocate, I feel it's important to oppose all efforts to restrict a woman's access to reproductive health care, because such efforts endanger women's health, limit women's equality, and actually erode religious liberty. Before I introduce you to our moderator, I did want to mention one other thing. On your chair are 3x5 cards. While the panel is discussing the topic of the day, if you have any questions, please write them down on the cards. We will have people picking them up from you, and at the end of the discussion, we will hand your questions to them. If you want your question answered by a particular individual, just write on the card who you want them to answer. Our moderator for today is Michele Kort, Senior Editor of Ms. Magazine, and thank you for the magazine. If you read her bio, you will see that she has been a journalist for more than 25 years. And her article, Global Sex Rules, The Price of Silence, where she writes about the horrific global gag rule on reproductive information, makes her more than capable of moderating this wonderful panel that we have. And Michele is then going to introduce the rest of the panel. So thank you for all being here, and I'll look forward.
Welcome, everyone. Am I sounding, is this on?
Hello?
Didn't know how close I should be.
Yeah, you
Okay.
have to be really close.
Here we go. So today is a very significant day in American history, certainly American women's history, all of our history. On this day, it was announced that the Supreme Court had, 40 years ago, had voted 7-2 in favor of the case Roe v. Wade, and abortion was now legal federally in the U.S. And I just had the opportunity to talk to Sandra Weddington, who argued the case before the Supreme Court. I don't know if you all know this, she was only 27 years old at the time that the case was decided. And she'd been working on it for a few years, starting in Texas. There were a number of cases coming up from states, and Roe and then this other one, Doe v. Bolton, were the ones that were chosen by the Supreme Court. So it's a great day of celebration, but it's also, and I think it renews our vigor in wanting to defend it, because in fact we've spent 40 years defending the right to legal abortion in this country. And especially because there's been more and more restrictions in state laws. There's been more than 100 new state laws restricting access to abortion in just the last 2 years. And if you followed Ms. Magazine, and if you read the one that I have there, which has our panelists on the cover, we talk about the war on women, which is how a lot of us are characterizing what's gone on in the last few years. So today we have a wonderful assortment of young women, and me and Dr. Fleisher. We're the only two who were alive before Roe v. Wade. But we're going to talk about some of the threats to it, and also what we can be doing proactively to keep strengthening it. One thing I will say that, you know, the inauguration yesterday was very good for Roe v. Wade, and that we know who our president will be appointing Supreme Court justices the next 4 years will be. Sarah Weddington was saying that, you know, the two times that she was most worried about elections were before Obama was elected and before Clinton was elected, because this, you know, a change of a vote on the court can be the end of Roe v. Wade. So we're a little relieved about that for the next 4 years, but not so relieved in state legislatures. And we're going to get to talk about federal, state, and local things today. So we're going to start off with Dr. Fleisher, who has been he is an OBGYN, and he has been an abortion provider since before it was legal, and he's going to talk to us about what it was like before Roe v. Wade, so you get some perspective on that.
Good afternoon. I'm the only member of the panel that's had first-hand experience with the full range of pregnancy terminations and all of their ramifications and complications. Let me start out by saying we must also talk in correct terms. The correct term is pro-choice, not pro-abortion, because all of us would like to see pregnancy terminations or abortions reduced to a minimum. Excuse me. Especially by promulgation, widespread availability, and the use of birth control. But the option or choice still must remain that of the pregnant woman. As Sarah Weddington, Jane Roe's lawyer, correctly stated, those who would force a woman to continue a pregnancy are in reality pro-birth, not pro-life. Because once the fetus is born, they're not out there adopting or otherwise caring for the unwanted or abnormal babies. I started out as an intern at LA County, predating Roe v. Wade, even before California's Roe v. Wade, which was 3 years earlier. My first rotation on the OBGYN service was something called IOB. That's infected OB, an entire ward of women suffering complications, infections, sterility, even death, from unsafe attempts at abortion by untrained or poorly trained personnel. Meanwhile, of course, those with the knowledge and the money could still get, even if clandestinely, relatively safe abortions. When I went into practice, the only valid reason for pregnancy termination was danger to the life of the mother, such as the rare but often lethal for the mother Marfan syndrome, where the mother's aorta can rupture in pregnancy. And then when a woman got German measles in pregnancy, we sent her to the psychiatrist, who said, oh my goodness, she's a threat to kill herself. And then in those days we had abortion and sterilization committees. So you sent this information to the all-male sterilization committee, where they would decide if the woman could have an abortion or not. In those days there were very few women in medicine, and the few that were, many of them went into pediatrics. When I went to medical school, there were 69 people in the class, 68 of us men and 1 woman. Since Roe v. Wade, I've done innumerable terminations, from early and easy to late and difficult. When done by experienced personnel in proper facilities, the procedure carries a low complication rate, a minuscule death rate, and yes, the complication and death rates are lower than that of a normal term pregnancy. I've taken care of women who have made the agonizing decision to terminate a wanted pregnancy, as well as seeing women who it was felt should have, for indicated medical reasons, terminated, yet who refused. Just last year, I had a lady who had a total placenta previa, which means the afterbirth is in front of the cervix and requires a cesarean section, and a fetus with an abnormality that almost 100% guaranteed the baby would die, either just before or just after birth. She elected to continue the pregnancy. I personally thought that's really stupid, but she should have the choice. An interesting sidelight, just to throw in something, the single biggest aid to improved safety and ease in doing abortions was the introduction of Japanese dehydrated seaweed. The little matchstick thing you put in the cervix and it absorbs fluid over the next 24 hours, dilates, and so it dilates the cervix without tearing tissue slowly over the next 12 to 24 hours. There's several problems which need to be addressed and solved today. First, the availability and promotion of birth control. There are a large number of birth control methods today, something we can discuss, but there are several that are less than 1% failure rate. Second, we need an increased number and availability of trained abortion providers. There are very few people being trained how to do them today. And third, ladies, realization that women of all ages must stop internal power struggles and infighting and get active in each and every state, because that's where the problems are. Because Roe versus Wade is still the national law, but as has been said and will be said again, in each individual state they're making more and more restrictions, making it doesn't make any difference if you got Roe v. Wade. And let me end by two thoughts from an editorial in today's New York Times. First, women will always find ways to end unwanted pregnancy, no matter what the law says, no matter what the risks to themselves. And second, there is no law that will end the practice of abortion. Only laws that can protect a woman's right to choose it or not, and to keep it safe and private as it still is. Thank you.
Our next speaker is on the cover of the magazine that I handed out. Sandra Fluke came to attention last year in a very dramatic way. She was going to speak before an all-male committee, as always, right? About the coverage of birth control in the Obamacare system. And she was prevented from doing that because, after all, you wouldn't want to hear a woman's voice talk about birth control, right? And instead, she spoke before a Democratic group, and then she was vilified, as you know, by Rush Limbaugh and other people, and she became a hero to many of us. And well, we at Ms. we don't use the diminutives. There's only actors and heroes. So
I disclaim all of these titles.
And if you watch the Democratic Convention, she gave a wonderful speech there. So the question I'm passing over to Sandra, because she studied law, is to tell us something about the legal case that became Roe v. Wade and what has happened legally since then in terms of the attacks on it and how we've maintained it since then.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this important discussion and occasion on this anniversary. I recently spoke to a group of lawyers, and I said to them, about the worst speaking engagement that you can have is being someone who's recently been sworn into the bar and needs to address a room full of lawyers. I think perhaps a close second is having just come from a red-eye flight from D.C. and straight from the airplane and having your 9-hour photo session magazine cover on everyone's chair, so no comparisons, please. But on a more serious and an important topic, I hope you're all thinking, gee, I wish I'd gone to law school and this is my opportunity to hear about the precedent and the details of these cases, because that's what you get for the next few minutes. And then we'll go on to talk about the really interesting aspects. So the case that most people are most familiar with is Roe v. Wade, which was the Supreme Court case, of course, decided 40 years ago today, January 22nd, 1973. And that case relied on the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, the Due Process Clause, and it found a right to privacy, a right for a woman to be able to have the privacy to make these types of decisions about whether or not to carry a pregnancy to term. Now, the court found that that right and that interest of the woman's needed to be balanced against two interests of the state. And those interests were the state's desire to protect women's health by regulating the ways in which you could access abortion to make sure that it would be safe and effective and would not pose a danger to a patient's health, and also the state's interest in protecting prenatal life. And that's the court's language, not necessarily mine. And so the court found that by balancing those interests, they found that it was constitutionally protected during the first trimester of a pregnancy. So abortion should be constitutionally required to be available at that point. The court later abandoned the trimester framework, but we'll say something about that in a moment. And the court also pegged when abortion must be available to the point of viability of the fetus, which they defined as the potential to be able to live outside of the woman's womb, albeit with artificial aid. And at the time that Roe was decided, that was about 7 months or 28 weeks. So let's pause for a moment to think about that standard as a starting place. It's really problematic because, of course, medicine and science, as I'm sure Dr. Fleisher could tell you much better than I could, has marched forward, and the framework of viability as a line, the law has not been able to keep up with that. It's not a good measure because a fetus can be kept alive, a preterm baby can be kept alive through much, much earlier deliveries. So that's been one of the ongoing struggles since Roe was decided. Now, the right to privacy is something that's an interesting question to think about, where that came from in the law, because a lot of us are familiar with it in Roe, but not what its origins were. The most direct source was a case called Griswold v. Connecticut. Folks heard of Griswold? Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Griswold v. Connecticut was a case that struck down a Connecticut law that said that it was illegal for anyone to purchase contraception or to use contraception. And this was the case of a married couple that wanted to access contraception and were arrested for doing so. And the court said that that was a violation of marital privacy, that within a marriage you had the right to make decisions about your life generally, whether to have children or not, those types of decisions. So the case didn't apply to unmarried women. That came a few years later in Eisenstadt v. Baird, which is a much less famous case. It was in Massachusetts, and the court said that you can't treat unmarried women differently than married women in this respect. And those cases, that marital right to privacy is actually based on things like you should be allowed to marry someone of a different race. So we're going back to cases like Loving v. Virginia. It's really interesting to me how all of these social justice constructs tie together in this line of cases, and how privacy is an idea that even in the law runs through so many of our civil rights and fights for various groups in the social justice spectrum. Now, unfortunately, since Roe, each subsequent Supreme Court case and many cases at other levels have seen a gradual rolling back of what Roe established. One case was Webster v. Reproductive Health Services. That was in 1989. And that case moved us away from the trimester framework, but stuck to the viability line that we discussed. Everyone's taking notes for the outline for the end of the semester. And then another important case was in 1992. This was Planned Parenthood v. Casey. This is perhaps the most damaging case for this line of reproductive health law. Planned Parenthood v. Casey was coming from Pennsylvania, which is the state where I was originally born before I moved to Los Angeles many years ago. And it was a Pennsylvania law that said that if a woman wanted to access an abortion, she needed to inform her partner. So it made it a joint decision and took it out of the woman's hands. Now this is potentially problematic in any relationship, but most problematic if you think of circumstance where a woman is a victim of domestic violence at the hands of that partner, potentially sexual assault by that partner. That could be the cause of the pregnancy in question. So that was the case before the court. The court established what's now known as the undue burden test. And this basically says that a court can restrict women's access to abortion up to a certain point as long as the burden is not undue. The burden is not too significant past this magic line that the judges decide where it is. So this opened the door for a number of restrictions on abortion access, things like that teenagers must have parental consent. Now you can see there would be a similar kind of issue if perhaps a young woman is the victim of incest, and that's why she needs to seek an abortion, and it could be very difficult to get parental consent. Or informed consent before a woman can have an abortion, and we're seeing things like states requiring doctors to give what is unquestionably medically invalid information to women, saying things like that abortion could increase your risk of breast cancer, which is absolutely incorrect. Also, things like 24-hour waiting periods, which are quite difficult for women with limited means to take off work and things like that. So Planned Parenthood v. Casey really opened the door to a long list of creative and very dangerous restrictions that we're now fighting. And the other significant case would just be in the 90s, there were two cases, Steinberg v. Carhart and Gonzalez v. Carhart. One was a case regarding a state law, and the other was regarding the congressional law. You've probably all remember the debate about the Partial Birth Abortion Act. Now, this was unquestionably a situation of losing the public relations war. Losing the messaging, people being really misinformed about what we were actually debating. We were debating a procedure that in some cases can be medically necessary, and Dr. Fleisher would certainly know more on this point than I would. And it's a procedure that was described in some very inflammatory terms in order to convince the court to outlaw a particular procedure, which while some women have a different option, some do not. And so it's been a dangerous precedent as well. And so that's really where we are today. We have come from a point of Roe v. Wade being a 7-2 decision, 7 in the majority finding this right to privacy, to a point where Roe v. Wade certainly hangs by one vote. Absolutely, it could be gone in a glimpse. And that's why it is so important that we think about who we elect as president and what kinds of justices he or soon, hopefully she, nominates. Not just to the Supreme Court, but also to the federal courts, because that's how these cases make their way up as well. So at the court level, this is a very, very prime question and a very important question. And now I'm going to stop boring you with phrases like undue burden and due process and 14th Amendment, and we will talk about the more interesting aspects of today's topic.
That was not boring. I signed personally. I think that was one of the most easy to understand explanations of those cases. Okay. I just want to mention a couple of other types of laws that have come up lately that you may or may not have heard of. I'm sure you've heard of the ultrasounds kind of laws and transvaginal, suggesting transvaginal probes, which if anyone's had one, it's about as intimate a procedure as you could have, and you don't want it if you don't have to. And then there's these things called TRAP laws, targeted regulations against abortion providers or something like that. But what they are is that they put undue burdens on abortion clinics saying how wide their hallways have to be, saying that their doctors have to have admitting privileges at the local hospital, very unnecessary things. And the whole idea of them is just to put the clinic out of business. And that's what Mississippi's going through right now. They're not closed yet, but they are certainly under threat if they don't meet all the requirements of this trap law. So, and that's, we mentioned before, California, on the other hand, is the most progressive state and had a legalization its own kind, California Roe v. Wade, 3 years before Roe v. Wade. And our next speaker is going to be, am I going to pronounce your name right? Josel? No, Serena. Serena, Josel.
Josel.
Josel. Okay, more French. Who's the Director of Public Affairs for Planned Parenthood LA and Deputy Director of the Planned Parenthood Advocacy Project. And I'm asking Serena about California. Tell us a little bit about California's situation with abortion, and we're going to talk about sort of proactive things because we've been on the defense in terms of Roe v. Wade for 40 years. And I often say, why don't we go on the offense? Well, I think California is a place that is more on the proactive side. So Serena.
So, well, first, thank you so much for having me here. I'm really honored to be on this panel with such a distinguished array of speakers. You know, I think it is really important for us, and the Roe anniversary is an important moment for all of us to reflect on the last 40 years and think about the successes and the challenges that we've faced and how we can learn lessons from all those experiences to apply to the future of this movement. But especially here in California, and I think especially after the important role that abortion played in the 2012 elections, we would be remiss if we didn't also push ourselves to think proactively about the world we want to live in 40 years from now. And where do we want to see women's health? And where do we want to see the state of private decisions around pregnancy and childbearing 40 years into the future? Because while Roe is critically important, our movement will not grow and will not encourage new leaders to come into the fold if we are all about one decision 40 years ago and always looking back. So I think it's important that we engage in this exercise of thinking proactively into the future. And there's really no better place to do that than here in California. So absolutely, California was one of the first states to legalize abortion. California was also the first state to expand its state Medicaid program to include family planning services like contraception and STD testing and treatment, especially for lower income and uninsured women. California was also one of the first states to take a more common sense approach to its teen pregnancy issue by requiring comprehensive sex education in schools and making contraception more affordable and accessible to teens. And because of those types of policies, we've led the nation in reducing teen pregnancy in our state. But we have more that we can do. And just last year, we had a great example of that. Last year, Los Angeles-based Assembly Member Holly Mitchell authored AB 2348. And actually, when I spoke on this panel last year, I mentioned it to all of you, encouraged you all to call your assembly members and state senators. And my assumption is that since the governor signed it into law last September, you all did that. So and Sandra actually was a great help for that in getting the word out over social media, because it was a kind of bill that wasn't terribly sexy. It wasn't a rallying cry. What it did was expand access to contraception by allowing RNs to dispense the most common forms of birth control, the pill, the patch, and the ring, in community clinic settings. And this may not seem like a big deal, but especially for women in rural communities, access to birth control in a matter of hours or days rather than having to wait weeks for an appointment is a really big issue. And those types of policy changes might seem minor, but they make a real impact in women's lives and women's access to care. This year, actually today I believe it's being introduced, we're introducing a bill that's being authored by Assemblywoman Toni Atkins from San Diego. She's introducing a bill that expands access to abortion in California, specifically by allowing advanced practice clinicians like midwives who have been trained to provide early first trimester abortions. At Planned Parenthood, we've actually partnered with UCSF for the past several years to study the safety of these early procedures by these trained clinicians. What we found is that they're extremely safe. The rates of complication are just as low as when physicians provide them. The patient experience is just as good and no offense to Dr. Fleisher, but in some cases even better than when physicians provide them. These clinicians tend to have some pretty great bedside manner. And we find that, especially as we head into healthcare reform, and we know that at least in the short term there will likely be provider shortages. These are important ways that we in California can make changes to our public policy to allow our clinicians to practice with the full scope of their training so that women have expanded access to early procedures when they need them. But I think that we can do more than that. And I think that, as we think about ways to engage young people and to keep our movement moving forward, we, as women, deserve to think beyond just abortion and birth control, but to think about fertility, to think about how we help young mothers complete their schooling on time, how we help women and men reach their goals when it comes to their families and their personal lives. And really come to not only in a legal setting respect people's decisions, but culturally respect the wide variety of situations that women and families face. The restrictions that we're seeing placed on our colleagues in other states are absolutely terrible. And we have an obligation to help them. We have an obligation to send funds, to send staff, to do what we can to help them hold the line. But I think that here in California, we have an obligation to do more than that here at home. We have to help them hold the line there in Mississippi and Texas and North Dakota. And here at home, we have to push the conversation forward.
So I think we're going from federal to state to local. Our next speaker, Reina Martinez, is a member of the Women's Advisory Board for the City of West Hollywood. And so she is a local activist, and although this word was, this expression may have been a little new to her, but there is a whole thing that's beyond reproductive rights, and we talk about reproductive justice. And that's the kind of things that Reina is interested in. So I wanted to ask her about talking about reproductive justice in terms of women of color, the LGBT community, and how that plays out, and how that's also important in our considerations of protecting our rights.
I am just so excited to be here today. Thank you so much, truly, for having me on the panel. A couple of observations that I made throughout the years since my membership with Hollywood Now in 2009 is we were always focusing with the youth how we had to bring Roe v. Wade into the attention of young women in college and high schools and just getting them empowered and becoming feminists and not taking for granted that momentum back in the 1960s of the pro-women's rights movements. But also my affiliation with the City of West Hollywood, I couldn't help but notice that the lesbian friends that I had, for some reason, were disconnected with Roe v. Wade, that it didn't apply to them because of their lifestyle, because they were butch. And I couldn't help but wonder that perhaps also transgender women thought that way. And the couple of friends that were transgender women also felt that disconnection, that Roe v. Wade did not apply to them. And to me, this is unacceptable. I have taken personally on this mission to unite all women, the transgender women, the lesbian women, and men, of course, who feel compelled to fight on behalf of Roe v. Wade. But we all need to come together and understand that this is unacceptable, that the war on women, the war on reproductive rights is unacceptable. And the election last year stood out for me not only because Obama won, but because women that were being interviewed on TV that were pro-Romney supporters were being interviewed coming on TV saying that they weren't voting for Romney because of immigration or the economy. They were voting because they were pro-life supporters. And that whole backwards rhetoric of the sanctity of life. And so I'm sitting there on TV and I'm thinking, okay, you're on TV talking about you're only voting for Romney because you're pro-life, with the whole sanctity of life, yet women are dying from illegal, unsanitary abortions. Who speaks for them? And I got so upset because I was like, you know what, that is so backwards to me when the blood of these women is on their hands. For all the pro-life women who are vocal out there talking about the sanctity of life is unacceptable to me. I want to share also one observation that I've made. Of course, since me being Hispanic, I've hung out at MacArthur Park. I go to areas like Boyle Heights. I go to the areas of Van Nuys and in the Valley. And one day I couldn't help but notice a billboard that said that the most dangerous place for a Latino African American is in the womb. And I got very infuriated because I was like, how dare you say that when you are posting these billboards in gang-infested areas?
Yep.
How dare you post that up here when there's gun violence? There is also the threat of prostitution and human trafficking, yet you're saying that the most dangerous place for a Latino or African American is in the womb. And that's why I'm personally on this mission to unite all women, because this is just ridiculous. I am tired of the backwards rhetoric from the pro-life movement. I'm just tired of these attacks. I was not only offended as a woman, but as a Latina, because obviously these billboards you were not going to see on the west side, only either in Compton or the areas that I visited, which are MacArthur Park, Boyle Heights, and in the Valley, in Van Nuys. And this just needs to stop. Another point that I want to bring out is, I can't tell you how many times on Hollywood Now I've said we need to change our strategies. It's all right for us to be out there talking about pro-choice, it's our rights, but also we gotta make the pro-life people be accountable for all those women that have died from illegal abortions, from all those women whose blood is on their hands, being forced by them purposely closing these abortion clinics. And the strategy definitely has to change out there. It is now our time. We have to leave a bigger legacy than the 1960s women's rights movements and in the rise of women in the 80s. We are now entering a new era of the woman, and I totally feel that, and this is our time now.
I get very excited by the women coming up. You know, it's like I'm still holding the torch, but I'm handing it off to women of this enthusiasm. We're going to sort of be open up to whatever people want to talk about, but I wanted to leap off of that to ask Serena about Planned Parenthood, the attacks on Planned Parenthood, especially recently in Texas, because obviously, as we, Dr. Fleisher said and stuff, well-to-do women can always find an abortion, that's safe or relatively safe. And but it's low-income women who always take the brunt of this around the world, not just here. And Planned Parenthood has been a saving grace for so many of them. And then you have places that want to defund Planned Parenthood, which only does 3% of its work is abortions, but then they want to cut all the health care of Planned Parenthood. So, Serena, would you talk about that?
Sure. So I think most of this really hit the national stage about, it was early 2010, I believe, was the first big national attempt to defund Planned Parenthood. And that was when the House of Representatives for the very first time voted to specifically defund Planned Parenthood. And fortunately, after 8 grueling weeks, that attempt was finally quashed in the Senate. But it has since then touched off a series of state-level attempts to do the same. And this is where it's really clear that the attack on women's health has expanded far beyond just abortion rights. Because, as Michele mentioned, Planned Parenthood provides a long list of preventive healthcare services, including life-saving cancer screenings, contraception, STD testing and treatment, health counseling, and abortion is an important part of what we do. But relative to the number of patients we see every year, it's a rather small percentage of what we do in our health centers, only 3% nationwide. And when you consider that 1 in 5 American women has relied on Planned Parenthood for her health care, these defunding attempts very clearly become an attack not just on Planned Parenthood, but an attack on women directly, and particularly an attack on young women, on uninsured women, on women of color, because for the majority of our patients, about 60% of our patients, we are their primary health care provider. We are where they go for their checkups. We are the only doctor they're seeing. Now in Texas, this is probably, I think, the most serious attempt we see, the attempt really going through. Rick Perry made clear that he would rather shut down the state's entire women's health program than allow Planned Parenthood to be a part of it. What's clear is that without Planned Parenthood, there isn't much of a women's health program in Texas. They simply don't have the provider capacity to serve the women in need in that state without Planned Parenthood being a part of that network. And despite jumping through numerous legal hoops and administrative hoops to clearly separate and make clear that their state funds are not going to the provision of any abortion services, the state has persisted and I fear may be successful in effectively keeping Planned Parenthood out. This is obviously very troubling, and there's ongoing work with our National Legal Department to try to put these attempts to bed, but we'll see what happens. But I think even here in Los Angeles, it's important to note that, you know, here in LA, while things are very good, there's a large number of women in our communities here who rely on these services. Here at Planned Parenthood Los Angeles, we have 19 health centers that provide about 270,000 patient visits every year. That's a really large portion of our local community that are relying on this safety net for their basic health care. I think at the national level, there will be more attempts to defund Planned Parenthood. I'm optimistic that those will not be successful because the young women in particular were up in arms. But I think that unfortunately into at least the near future, this will be an ongoing battle.
In fact, if I can just add, the bill to defund Planned Parenthood on the federal level, and let's remember that as our opening remarks included, this is about taking away funding for contraception, for breast cancer screenings, for other aspects of women's health, because there is no federal funding for abortion unless it's a case of incest, rape, or the life of a woman. So that attempt has already been renewed. It's been introduced into the 113th Congress as one of the very first bills, once again, so absolutely a continuing fight.
And excuse me, in case you don't think that public opinion can make a difference, how many of you have seen anything from the Susan G. Komen Foundation lately?
Yes.
I think maybe we'll start asking some of these questions, and then people can also join in with anything else they want to add. But we have some interesting questions, and I'll start with this one for Dr. Fleisher. Why aren't OBGYN residents trained to do abortions? And why does Kaiser send patients to outside abortion clinics?
I'll take the second question first. Very simple. It's efficient and cheap. Cheaper. They go to facilities that's what they spend their time doing, and they have a system set up where they can provide that service very effectively, competently, at a much lower price than it would cost us to do in our hospitals, because you can do these as outpatients and they have a better setup. That's the second part. The first part again was?
Training. Why were doctors training new physicians? Why are doctors
trained?
Well, because of Planned Parenthood and because of Kaiser. LA County and UCLA are seeing very few women anymore that need this done. Of course, when I was trained, there was nobody teaching it. But then when we started doing them, we would train residents, but then they go to outside facilities that are just, that's what they do, and they're very good and very efficient at it. And the county hospital is training less and less people because there are very few people going to county to have their pregnancy terminations.
If I can add to that on a national level, in addition to the local expertise, there's a lot of political pressure on medical universities, medical schools, and training programs to not include this type of training as well. And there, you know, we can talk about sort of the public relations battle and what different generations believe about abortion and about Roe, but there have been efforts that have cut into medical students' interest in the trainings. There have been efforts to cut away the funding for it. So there are some very good efforts to try to reverse that trend. There are groups like Med Students for Choice who are working on this strongly, but it is a really critical access issue, especially in rural areas and in certain states.
I have a question here about, it's kind of a legal one, but have the trap law, I guess this is a state law question, have the trap laws, 24-hour waiting periods, etc., been challenged and upheld? And maybe I'd add to that question, because there was a question about the Attorney General doing anything to challenge these kinds of things.
know.
Maybe we can jointly answer this one. So the trap laws are happening on various state levels. They're not happening on a federal level, so it wouldn't necessarily be an attorney general issue. So in certain states, and just to expand a little bit on what the trap laws are, it's a series of regulations like how high the ceiling needs to be, how wide the hallway needs to be. A lot of times it's turning clinics into hospital regulations in ways that are very unnecessary and very financially burdensome as a way of shutting them down. There have been a number of challenges to them, most of which I think are still in process, and there are varying decisions in different state courts. Want to add to that?
Well, I think that, so there's the legal question of the trap laws, and some we've been able to get tied up in court, some we just actually defeated a pretty onerous one in Alabama last year that was making its way through their legislature. Obviously the ones in Mississippi have been going back and forth for a while now. And the legal discussion is very important, but this is, I think, where kind of the cultural conversation also becomes really important, because whether it's the trap regulations or the 24-hour waiting period or the forced ultrasounds, the suggestion of all of these restrictions is that you didn't really think about this, that you need to consider what you're doing, as if you had nothing better to do with your Saturday morning. And I don't mean to make light of it, but that is basically what they're saying, right? That you can't be trusted to make this serious decision on your own. And I think that that's where the cultural conversation is really important, and evolution around how we talk about these issues, so that we can build understanding and respect for the diverse array of situations a woman might find herself in, and just why it is so important for all of us to respect women in making the decision that is best for her and her family without political interference. Because there is certainly no way for any of us to walk in her shoes. And all these restrictions are impose unnecessary delays and added expense to women who are already making a very difficult decision.
And it's interesting to connect that to that some of the most controversial abortions are the latest in the pregnancy. Now, a lot of those are for medical reasons and other types of concerns, but the number of restrictions and delays placed on women pushes abortions into that time period. When we make it so unaffordable and so inaccessible, we're complicating that problem that some people have concerns with.
By the way, there's a movie, speaking of late-term abortions, that's premiering at Sundance this week, and when it becomes available, you should see it. It's called After Tiller. And After Tiller, it's interviews with four of the remaining late-term abortion providers in the U.S. Dr. Carhart of the famous Supreme Court cases, Dr. Hearn, and I'm going to forget the others' names, but two women, the other two. I was just going to say, because Dr. Tiller is famous for having a sign on his wall that said, "Trust women." That's how he looked at things. I want to ask one of the questions, so I get Reina in over here. Someone here writes, women who were born after Roe v. Wade are unaware of the struggle women went through. They do not think it would ever change back to the way it was, illegal. What can be done to make young women aware of this? But I think we have to question the question too and say, is it really true that young women are not aware of this? And so you can answer the question and also the other question of the question.
I'll answer it from my own personal experience. Looking back from the 1960s, perhaps because I was always a political science major, we always looked at it with great nostalgia as if we were there. Like, how empowering was that to see like these waves of women out there empowered and burning their bras, and we have the right to do this and to do that. But I will admit that there have been a couple of high school students that it's very frustrating that they look back at it and they're like, well, that was in the 60s. When we're raised now that we can be an astronaut, a lawyer, we can do anything men can do. And I'm like, no, that's not the case. And I think that, of course, dialogue, communication plays a big role. That high school student, perhaps, that you're interacting with will make a change in just bringing up that discussion. Hollywood Now has been affiliated with talking to a lot of high school students. We are trying to raise that machine of young feminists, starting them young, getting them educated, and of course, you know, bringing back that nostalgia of, yes, the 1960s were awesome. We all wish we could be there, but this is what's going on now. And even though it is 40 years of this struggle, we need to be out there once again marching. I will never get tired of looking back also at how minorities, especially the Hispanics, Latinos, we're out there marching for the DREAM Act. We're out there marching for immigration reform. And every time I see footage of that on TV, I'm like, how amazing would that be if all of us, men, women, all of us, the LGBT community, we're out there marching like this on Pershing Square and just, you know, talking about Roe v. Wade as, you know, this is my right. Yes, we're all pro-choice, but emphasizing the right, the semantics of it. This is my right to do whatever I want to do with my body. And I think, of course, it all comes back to dialogue. Just having that conversation with them. You might think that one person that you're talking to doesn't count, but it does, because the information that you're telling them will go ahead and pass along to others. And you gotta just empower them.
Actually, I have an article I added in the upcoming issue of Ms. about teaching feminism in high school, which, you know, women's studies is great once you get to college, but I think it really should be taught at the lower and lower level.
Yep.
This was something that was brought up before, and there's a question about it, and so I thought I would ask it. Planned Parenthood recently announced that they were looking to move away from the pro-choice terminology for being too narrow. What is your opinion on this, and what sort of framing should we use instead? And someone else wrote, because it's sort of related, speaking of losing the PR campaign, when will we start calling issues and taking our issues such as late-term abortion, and not calling it partial birth, and using the expression anti-choice instead of pro-life? Why do we continue to allow the right to hijack these terms?
I'm so glad that someone asked this question, or both of these questions, because it's something I've been thinking about a lot in framing where do we go from here. Because we did have a very monumental election this year where women's health concerns played a larger than normal role, and there's a lot of energy and passion right now, and we need to harness that to be able to move forward. Now, just a little bit of background on the choice to move away from the pro-choice label. This occurred because of some focus groups and research that showed that fewer people are identifying with the pro-choice label, but the numbers of people who believe that abortion should be legal and safe are higher than those who consider themselves pro-choice. And that can be kind of a little bit to wrap your head around, right? Because that's what pro-choice means for many of us, is that we believe it should be safe and legal and each individual should be able to choose. But we're seeing that the label's not reflecting that to perhaps folks who are less tapped into this movement. Some of them had responses like, well, I'm not in favor of abortion personally, and I wouldn't feel comfortable having one, but I believe that someone else should have the legal right to be able to, so I'm not pro-choice. Because it has almost become conflated with pro-abortion or pro-your own personal stance. And there were other folks who had a reaction like, I'm not pro-choice, I believe that it depends on the circumstances and what the situation is, whether this is right or wrong, or perhaps whether it should be legal or not. Again, many of us think that that opinion is encapsulated in the term pro-choice. But what's coming through in this research is that perhaps our messaging is not clear when we say pro-choice. And so some organizations, Planned Parenthood included at the national level, have made the decision to start talking to people using the terms that these focus groups are using, the terms that folks who are less involved in the movement are relating to, because we have to always aim our messaging at those we want to convince, at those who we need to be our allies, not at ourselves internally, right? Now, in terms of where to go next, my personal opinion on this, and there are a number of folks in the movement who've been talking about this over the last probably decade or so, is that a reproductive justice construct is a helpful next step. Now, who's heard of reproductive justice before? Okay, good. Good, we've got some folks. Now, reproductive justice is basically defined as a movement with a goal that all people should be able to control their reproduction and have the choice of when or if to have children, free of discrimination and violence. And I think I've left out a few other modifiers, but that's the basic idea. It not only encapsulates the right to safe and legal abortion, but to be able to economically have the means to access things like contraception and other types of health care. It includes, as we mentioned earlier, things like fertility treatments, having access to that if you have reproductive challenges in that respect. And it connects to a lot of other social justice movements. So I think Reina was talking about how LGBT community members don't always see that Roe is as relevant for them. Well, you know what? It is really relevant because Lawrence, you guys know the Lawrence Supreme Court decision, which struck down anti-sodomy laws that criminalized certain types of sexual activity. That's based on Roe. That's based on the right to privacy. So very relevant. But the reproductive justice movement encapsulates LGBT concerns because it would include fighting for any couple to be able to adopt children or to have access to reproductive health technologies allowing them to parent and to conceive. It connects to worker justice movements because it says that women who work in a nail salon or a factory where there are chemicals that they're exposed to that impact their ability to have children in the future, that's a reproductive justice concern. And many have said that it better represents the concerns of communities of color who historically the struggle has been to be able to parent, to not have your children removed, to not undergo forced sterilization, as well as the concerns of more economically viable white women who have been struggling for the right to abortion. So it's a broader construct, and it really encapsulates many of the other health concerns. I think you can see some of the ways in which this can be I think our next rallying cry, our way forward, because it brings in a lot of folks who believe in legal access to health care, even if they're uncomfortable with some of the personal moral questions around abortion. It connects us to a broader social justice movement, and I think it can harness the energy of the millennial generation. You know, the DREAM Act, aspects of immigration reform fall into a reproductive justice construct. And that's a way to really connect for our generation where the energy is and to include these concerns. So, reproductive justice, that's our next step.
But how are we going to say that? Are we, you say I'm pro-choice, you say I'm pro-reproductive justice?
Absolutely.
Well, and I think that, one of the interesting things, because we've been struggling with this question for a little while, it's not a surprise that these terms don't really work anymore, and they especially don't work with younger people, and they don't work with communities of color. So if we don't want to just keep talking to ourselves, our language needs to evolve. And what the research shows that it's not so much about finding a new label, it's about moving beyond labels altogether. It's about accepting that these are very personal, nuanced issues that people have complicated and sometimes contradictory feelings about. And our language should be authentic enough to speak directly to that. So it's not about saying, I'm pro-choice. It's about saying, I support women's access to safe and legal abortion. That's clear. There's no ambiguity around my position in that. And the thing that's kind of interesting is that millennials in particular are really resistant to the use of labels, not just on this issue, but on a wide variety of issues. It's interesting because they're not at all resistant to identifying themselves with brands. They're the generation that's most comfortable identifying with brands. They're perfectly comfortable identifying as a Planned Parenthood supporter, for example. But these labels of pro-choice and pro-life really don't work for them. There was a study done in 2011 that showed that as many as 20% of millennials didn't identify with either term. And so I think this in many ways reflects what we've been seeing on the national political stage for a while. If you watch 24-hour news networks, it often feels like you've got one extreme arguing with the other extreme. And we know that the majority of America is in the middle. And for a long time, they haven't heard their voice reflected in this conversation. And we want to start engaging more people in this conversation, and an authentic conversation at that acknowledges the complexity and sensitivity of these issues. Then we need to get out of political rhetoric, out of speaking like we're bumper stickers, and instead having real conversations. And I think that's part of what this is. I think this is our first big step in that direction.
I just wanted to bring up, so we didn't miss it, in talking about reproductive justice and the whole reproductive life of women and families, especially for what Sandra went through, talking about Obamacare. We've written for years and Ms. about how the attack on abortion is not just on abortion, but on contraception. And so Obamacare has made contraception very inexpensive for women now. It's pretty extraordinary. The women I know who still are reproductive age. But I got the notice from the health company. I said, it's not going to help me. Health insurance, yeah. But anyway.
Many other aspects of that same regulation, the Women's Preventative Health Care Regulation, apply to women of all ages. So getting no-cost access to breast cancer screenings and domestic violence screenings and a number of other women's health concerns.
I don't know.
No one should feel left out.
But I wanted to know if you all were talking, and Dr. Fleisher mentioned this too, talking about birth control and abortion as kind of the same coin kind of thing, and how for years there's been an attempt to promote better contraception as a way to lessen abortion, and yet then we've got the right trying to lessen our access to contraception at the same time.
Right.
You want to say something about that?
No, I agree totally that all forms of contraception should be widely available, and I think one of the things that's being missed is the fact that the newer contraceptives, the ones that go in the uterus or the rod that's implanted in the arm, all have a failure rate of less than 1%. And while the birth control pills are supposed to be very effective, there's a difference in anything that women have to take. There's a difference between their theoretical effective rate and their actual effective rate. Because you find that the reason that the failure rate in the birth control pills is 8 to 10% is because they forget them, they get lost, it wasn't convenient, whatever. They don't take them regularly. When you put the intrauterine device in or you put the rod in the arm, they don't have to do anything. It's there. The failure rates are under 1% for all three of them. And so that's the kind of thing that needs to be publicized and made available. And that'll decrease the need for abortion.
I can just add a quick overview of some of the challenges that we're seeing to access to contraception and to the affordability of contraception. The Affordable Care Act's regulation, which says that private insurance that women pay for through their own premiums and deductibles must cover access to contraception with no cost sharing. And that's being challenged. There are like 40 different cases at this point. This is an all-out attack on this regulation, and it's an effort to take it to the Supreme Court. And many of those cases are based on the idea that certain types of contraception are abortion, just medically inaccurate, but there are some judges who seem to be convinced by this reasoning, unfortunately. It's also about religious liberty constructs, and were we currently, I want to be clear, currently, this is constitutional. There's no religious liberty concern based on Supreme Court precedent. Were these cases that are very, unfortunately, politically and ideologically charged to lose on those religious liberty grounds, it would be a significant concerns for a wide area of personal liberty in this way, not just around reproductive health care. There are also legislation to the personhood amendments. Have you heard about personhood amendments? Giving the 14th Amendment full personhood to even a fertilized egg. These would make many areas of contraception illegal. So there's a broad challenge. There are attempts not only to defund Planned Parenthood specifically, but to defund all of Title X at the federal level, which provides the funding for contraception for the poorest women in our communities. So it's a broad effort, absolutely.
And what about coverage for abortion in the Affordable Care Act?
So As we said, the Hyde Amendment is in place. The federal government does not use its funds to cover abortion unless it's a case of rape, incest, or the life of a woman. The Affordable Care Act also allows states to prohibit insurance companies, private insurance companies, from including abortion care in their plans. So there are some, unfortunately, really problematic provisions in there.
I want to ask this question to Reina because of her T-shirt. If you've seen the T-shirt. So.
I love pro-choice boys.
So this question is, educating women and young girls is vital to the longevity of Roe v. Wade, but how can we get younger generations of boys and men to understand and fight for women's bodies and women's rights?
That is an excellent question. One that I really honestly, wow, to get boys. I guess it all goes back to, the family. Our responsibilities as mothers who do have sons, opening up that dialogue and just telling them what Roe v. Wade is, and how it was said earlier, it's not just about abortion, but our reproductive rights. It is the right of a woman to choose to not have an undue burden beyond reasons of whatever, if it's legitimate rape or whatever privacy issues she decides to not have the baby. But as far as boys, I know some of the feminist clubs in high schools that I've, spoken at, there have been boys that just got interested because it was not only as a women's issue, but a human rights issues that they saw internally. And they could just not sit there and, have women being oppressed through this backwards rhetoric from the pro-life movement.
I think one of the positive aspects of the reproductive justice construct, which regardless of labeling, because I do agree with you about the labeling concerns, but as a framework for all of us to use in our advocacy and activism and our thinking, one of the positive aspects of the reproductive justice construct is it includes men more specifically, because it's about men's reproductive health care and reproductive rights as well. It's about young men having access to testicular screenings. There's a bill in Congress that was in from the last Congress and will likely be reintroduced that would ensure that vets, frequently men in this particular case, who suffer injuries that impact their ability to conceive children in the future, should have access to the fertility treatments they need as a result of those injuries. That's a reproductive justice effort that's really about men's health care as well. So it's about expanding the conversation on the whole reproductive health front.
And it's interesting, at the local level, I just think this question is great, obviously, but we have a group of high school peer educators at Planned Parenthood. There's actually about 70 or 80 of them in LA, and we actually have an easier time in some cases recruiting boys to be participants in the program. And we see the same thing in our condom distribution programs at schools. The boys are actually very proud to come in and get condoms. They even come in and get tested, and sometimes they'll tell us they're not even sexually active yet. We're like, you really don't need to worry about this. But, I think that we kind of need to be creative in capitalizing on the very natural interests that teenagers, both male and female, have in sex. Because what we find is that when we frame it as a health conversation, boys are actually fairly interested and engaged, and really it's our responsibility to help engage them in that conversation, because none of us get knocked up by ourselves. There was a man involved in this somewhere, right? So, and they're terribly interested. So it's been an interesting exercise. I work with them on their advocacy work, and we do a lot of sex ed work with them. And they've been tremendous advocates. They take it really seriously. We just had a couple of them testify before the LUSD school board last fall about the importance of having condoms and other sexual health services available on campus so they don't have to worry about transportation and cost. And they're just tremendous. And I think a lot of it is just waiting for someone to have a conversation that treats them as mostly like adults. Not getting derailed by the slang and some of the kind of more provocative things they might say, but really having an honest, medically accurate conversation, because I think many of them are really thirsty for that. It's hard to find that. You know, there's so much sexual content everywhere you look, on TV and movies and magazines and music, but there are very few meaningful conversations about sex happening with our youth. And I think that they're really interested in learning about that, and that's true for both sexes.
When in 2005, when there was the March on Women's Lives in D.C., were any of you there? Yeah. Okay. My sister insisted on going with her 10-year-old son, and you know, that was really great. So that, you know, as a Reformed Jew and, you know, progressive Reformed Jew, I think that this talk of reproductive justice and all these things linking together, I mean, I'm sure you all were as thrilled as I was by the inaugural speech yesterday. And I think the thing that got me most was that line about Seneca Falls to Selma to Stonewall. That all of these movements get linked together, and I think it's the linkage that makes us strong. You know, I just kind of like to throw a question to the panel. You know, having worked at News and stuff and getting, you know, crazy letters from the antis, you know, you can't, I always feel like you can't change their minds. You know, they are who they are. And if I've ever tried to talk to any of them, they just twist whatever I say. So you can't even answer their notes, unfortunately. But maybe we could just, if we could talk, panel, about, because this goes to one of the questions too, what more can be done to change the dynamic? But what more can we do? Because we're not going to change them, but we have to strengthen and draw from all of who we are, you know, to move forward in a proactive way.
Well, I think one of the things that has to be done is the people that come to meetings like this already have an inclination and are already pro-choice. They have to go out and talk to their friends who don't come to meetings like this and convince them that it's important. Because talking to ourselves is great, it's enjoyable, but it doesn't accomplish much. Because I would imagine there isn't anybody in here that is not pro-choice. If they are, there may be one, but I would doubt it.
To echo that, I mean, I think that we need to have more authentic conversations and challenge ourselves to talk about this in a way that goes beyond politics, because I think a lot of people are really tired of political conversation and political rhetoric, and this is ultimately a personal decision, and so we tend to not talk about it in a personal way because, you know, we want to respect others' privacy. We feel maybe a sense of shame about our own decisions that we've made when it comes to pregnancy or childbearing. But it's really important for all of us to have those authentic conversations with our friends and family members, because through conversation, I think oftentimes comes understanding. And I think especially for women who do have more history with this movement, those are important stories. And we need to move forward, but it is important to look back and to hear from the women and men who were on the front lines. Because, you know, as someone who goes to work on this movement every day, those stories keep you going and providing a little bit of extra motivation some days. And so it's important to have those conversations. And I think it's also important for us to keep moving forward. I think it's important for us to, you know, while we're reflecting and remembering, to keep on asking what more should we be doing and to push ourselves, because otherwise we'll just stagnate.
I would really agree with the way that you framed that around thoughtful and productive conversations. A couple of the strategies that I find to be effective in trying to do that are to really try to listen to the person who disagrees and to understand what the source of their disagreement is, because so often we're sort of getting worked up and getting angry by what they're saying that we're not hearing them. So just try to listen. Frequently you find instances of perhaps misinformation around the particular law that they oppose, or around what the circumstances really look like when a woman has to make these types of decisions. So there are ways that we can have a more productive conversation by better understanding where they're coming from. These are not in 99% of these cases, not inherently unreasonable or hateful people. We just have different bases of understanding. And to ask questions about why do you believe that, and why do you think that that's true of most women or of all women? Are you certain about that? That hasn't been my experience. And to really share our own experiences, as was said, the idea that these are private topics is a really interesting one, because yes, certainly in the law we have this basis in the right to privacy, which is very important. But if we think from a justice perspective about what gets labeled as private, often the things that get labeled as private do us a disservice. It's private if you're being abused in your home. That's a family matter. It's private if you needed to have an abortion. It's private if you had a sexual assault. By making these things private, it, yes, absolutely protects us and allows us to make choices about what we share, and each of us as individuals needs to have those legal rights and those social rights to determine what we want to talk about and what we want to ask other people about, what they want to share. But by making them private topics that we don't share, it allows many of these problems like domestic violence to continue. This certainly goes back to the second wave feminist construct that the personal is political, right? And when we share the personal, that has a political impact, and it has a social justice and social change impact. So by sharing our own stories and finding a way that's safe and comfortable to do that, we can have an impact on the world around us as well.
I would say being observant in your community. Of course, I can take for granted what National Now is posting, Miracle Mile now, Hollywood Now, Neural Pro-Choice, but I have to go ahead and take responsibility for what happens in my community. Like I said, simple conversations with my LGBTQ friends led to me noticing that there's a disconnection between them and Roe v. Wade. Going around in my neighborhood, just randomly looking at the billboards and being insulted by what they were posting and being vocal about it. Just taking that personal responsibility. And I also think that women who've had abortion need to speak up. And if the moment is right, just talk about your own experiences, just like women who have been survivors of domestic violence, take that step forward and speak up, making it not so much of a taboo issue. So that's all I would just have to say. Thank
you. I wanted to thank everyone here. Thank Dr. Fleisher for all the years of service toward women. And these wonderful young women here, smart and full of great ideas and action, and I love that you're coming up behind us oldsters. And I wanted to say, just on behalf of Ms., I had cards, I don't know if you got them, that offers a free subscription because of our anniversary. But also, I think one of the action steps you can do is to send a gift subscription to people that you think need a little more convincing and a little more information. Okay. And you can also read our Ms. blogs, A Daily Thing.
Wait, please do not leave before you fill out